2023 was mostly a great year for movies, but we have to stress the word mostly, because no year of cinema is without its bevy of absolute dreck. The last 12 months have certainly been populated with their fair share of dud films from both camps, whether released on the big screen or relegated to screening. If bad movies can be a riot to laugh along with up until a point, then these films took viewer patience to the absolute limit. So let's take a look back. I'm Adam, this is What Culture, and these are our 20 worst movies of 2023. Number 20, Magic Mike's Last Dance. Steven Soderbergh turned in a rare dud this year with his third and allegedly final Magic Mike film, which rather than triple down on the bromantic vibes and celebratory flesh circus of its two predecessors, went in a mostly different, wildly unwanted direction. Soderbergh opted instead to focus Magic Mike's Last Dance on Mike's relationship with a wealthy socialite and, most weirdly of all, their attempt to put on a stripper's stage play. Even if you can't forgive how this is a transparent advert for the Magic Mike live stage show, there's a depressing absence of Mike's stripper pals, save for a pathetic cameo via Zoom, with their camaraderie being a high point of the previous movies. And worst of all, why on earth did anyone think that a movie marketed on guys stripping needed to be narrated by a young girl? Bizarre doesn't even begin to describe it. Number 19, The Meg 2, The Trench. There are many things we expected The Meg 2 to be, but boring? Not a chance. Even with the great Ben Wheatley in the director's chair, the first 90 or so minutes of this thing are a strangely low-energy slog. And it isn't until the final massacre on Fun Island that it finally nails the campy vibe it's been desperately lacking up to that point. Jason Statham certainly tries, bless him, but for as trashy fun as the first film was, this sequel lacked the same giddy punch for the most part. Did anyone ask for a movie about giant prehistoric sharks to feature realms of tiresome exposition? Number 18, Marlo. Now on paper, there's an absolutely great movie to be made of Liam Neeson playing an aged version of Raymond Chandler's legendary detective Philip Marlowe. But this isn't it. Despite being directed by the great Neil Jordan and boasting a script penned by William Monaghan, this is a lifeless generic film noir that never once manages to get out of first gear. Neeson effectively sleepwalks through a role that he ultimately feels miscast in, the occasional fight suggesting it wasn't really written for a 70-year-old actor to begin with. Beyond that, it's just a massive snooze fest. The drama lacks intrigue, the action stinks, and not even the period setting is up to much. What a bore. Number 17, Fool's Paradise. Charlie Day's long-awaited debut Fool's Paradise actually started filming way back in October 2018, which really tells you all you need to know about how well production evidently went. Following reshoots conducted in 2021, the film finally came out in 2023 to well-earned critical scorn. A limp, aggressively weird Hollywood satire that feels less like a coherent story than a collection of wacky ideas Day came up with while drinking with his It's Always Sunny pals. Day's usual hijinks are seriously clipped by his protagonist being mute, giving co-star Ken Jeong the floor to deliver the single most irritating performance of his career, which is really saying something. Even with the bevy of appearances and cameos from the likes of Kate Beckinsale, Adrian Brody, Jason Sudeikis, Edie Falco, Jason Bateman, Common, Ray Liotta, John Malkovich, and Glenn Howerton, this thing is painful to sit through. Number 16, Five Nights at Freddys. The big screen adaptation of hit video game Five Nights at Freddy's had a ton of potential, so for it to be transformed into a strangely talky, wildly overlong, and not even remotely scary horror film is a huge disappointment. Save for the solid animatronic effects and Josh Hutcherson's decent lead performance, there's desperately little meat on these bones, and the script's attempts to reconcile the series' convoluted lore for non-fans ultimately only makes it even more of a scarcely comprehensible mess. The film's storming box office success clearly shows that it worked well enough for die-hard fans, but anyone not already all in on this IP, this was just horrendously dull. Number 15, Heart of Stone. Heart of Stone is an almost perfect example of a totally soulless, programmatic streaming action flick you'll come across on Netflix and you'll ask yourself, have I seen it? A bland spy yarn fronted by Gal Gadot in pure autopilot mode, its worst crime, however, is wasting a talented ensemble cast, including Glenn Close giving one of the most blatant gimme the paycheck performances of the entire year. Beyond a few mildly entertaining action beats, this is flavorless slop of the highest order, despite clearly marking yet another attempt by Netflix to birth a new franchise. Number 14, Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom. Expectations couldn't have been lower for the second and final Aquaman movie per the tidal wave of de-hype that preceded its release. And boy, what an unceremonious end to the DC extended universe this was. Horribly scripted, clunkily edited, and packed with eyesore-inducing VFX, Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom lacked most of the original's periodic charm and visual grandeur, with the end product very clearly being hacked to ribbons by a desperate Warner Brothers. Jason Momoa tries his damnedest to prop the sinking Enterprise up, but what can he really do with material this rough? Quite fittingly, in a year packed with disappointing tentpole releases, 2023's final mega-budget blockbuster also proved to be the very worst. Number 13, Retribution. As gimmick thrillers go, Retribution at least had a fun concept, with Liam Neeson's embattled protagonist forced to stay sat down in his car to avoid a bomb exploding if he moves from it. But that's basically where the amusement ends for this thoroughly naff riff on speed minus the charm, excitement, and basic sense of thrills. The script evidently struggles to drag the concept out to feature length, throwing in a desperate plot twist and yawn-inducing villain reveal you're likely to see coming at least a few miles away. While it's certainly preferable to having Neeson continuing to beat up men one-third his age, this is a thoroughly immobile action thriller that remains stuck in neutral for its entirety. Number 12, The Outlaws. Yet another embarrassingly low-effort genre film from Netflix now with The Outlaws, in which a bank manager comes to suspect that his future in-laws recently robbed his bank. Given that this was directed by the man responsible for two of the worst Netflix originals ever, Father of the Year and The Wrong Missy, this certainly could have been much more a disaster. But outside of Pierce Brosnan's glorious facial hair, it doesn't offer much pleasure at all. This feels like one of those movies that the cast probably had a ton of fun making, and yet so little of that enjoyment transpires through the film itself. Number 11, White Men Can't Jump. Was there anyone on this earth asking for a remake of 1992's legendary sports comedy White Men Can't Jump? It is a film so thoroughly ensconced in its era that a remake just feels like a massive waste of time. And unsurprisingly, this redo's lead pairing of Cinco Walls and Jack Harlow can't even begin to match the unforgettable chemistry of the original's Wesley Snipes and Woody Harrelson. Doing little interesting to update the original sports hustling setup for modern audiences, this is a drab piece of streaming content which embodies Hollywood's worst instincts for seeing successful one-off movies as IP to be endlessly exploited. Even fans of the late, great, brilliant Lance Reddick, who gives one of his final performances here, will struggle to make it to the end. And before we get into the top 10, let us know in the comments what's been your worst movie of this year. And you know what? While you're at it, why don't you let us know which film you think is underappreciated? This is your time. Sound off in the comments down below. Number 10, Spy Kids Armageddon. Well, Robert Rodriguez went back to the well and rebooted this much-loved Spy Kids franchise for Netflix. The horror. The year's categorical Why Though movie, Spy Kids Armageddon, rehashes the much-loved family-friendly action-adventure franchise to grossly diminishing turns, while teasing out career-worst performances from both Zachary Levi and Gina Rodriguez. It's not cute, it's not funny, the action stinks, and it looks obscenely cheap. There's just nothing creative or even basically thoughtful here, just a filmmaker reheating their prior successes for a new generation. Number 9, The Exorcist Believer. David Gordon Green's legacy sequel to The Exorcist is horrifying in all the wrong ways. First off, it feels like a garden variety exorcism flick that got turned into an Exorcist movie during development. And even accepting that, it brings desperately little fresh or even basically unique to the table. Worst of all, however, is how it engages with The Exorcist as an IP, bringing Ellen Burstyn back for a thankless supporting appearance that's sure to anger fans, ahead of a wildly misjudged twist ending which completely whiffs the tone Green was striking for. The Exorcist Believer was a box office hit regardless though, so the two planned sequels are going ahead. Good God. Number 8. Assassin Club. The director behind The Transporter Refueled returns to the lame-brained action thriller well for Assassin Club, a tedious 2-hour romp in which Henry Golding's hitman faces off against 6 targets, who have all been hired to kill one another. It's hardly the worst concept in the world, but this dead formulaic outing never manages to feel like anything more than a charmless cut-price John Wick, with Golding once again proving he's just not suited to play an action hero. Riddled with mouldy exposition dialogue, generic plotting, too many characters, and forgettable action sequences peppered with laughable VFX, there's nothing here for all but the most forgiving of genre fans to latch onto. Number 7. My Big Fat Greek Wedding 3. The My Big Fat Greek Wedding franchise finally sputtered to an apparent conclusion with its recent third entry, which is terrible enough to make you reconsider just how much you liked the original first film at all. This desperate rom-com threequel takes Tula and her family off to Greece for a no-effort destination comedy that's successful only as a plug for Athens tourism. Nia Vardalos steps into the director's chair this time, yet seems to be phoning in her work in triplicate as writer, director, star, with the film itself failing to justify why it exists beyond the obvious financial incentive. Given that it made less than half of what the second film made at the box office though, that's probably all she wrote for this franchise. Number 6. On a Wing and a Prayer. And the bleakest addition to the pile in 2023 was the based on true events On a Wing and a Prayer, which stars Dennis Quaid as Doug White, a man forced to pilot a light aircraft containing his family after the pilot dies mid-flight. In the right hands, this could have been a tight survival drama, but instead there's no tension to be found. The faith-based aspect is unbelievably corny, and Dennis Quaid gives a risible performance in the lead role, with co-star Heather Graham not too far behind. Number 5. Freelance. Freelance feels like a relic of an action comedy that Hollywood stopped making about a decade ago, where a hot guy and a hot girl get reluctantly teamed together in an exotic environment and sexy shenanigans ensue. Except Freelance is a strictly algorithmic rendition of that concept, with John Cena and Alison Brie thoroughly slumming it as an ex-soldier and journalist who finds themselves caught in the middle of a brutal military coup. A virtually laughless experience packed with generic action, Freelance fails to exploit the charms of its likable leads, leaving them stranded and flailing for 109 exhausting minutes in a film destined to be forgotten in record time. Number 4. Assassin. Now, there's no joy whatsoever including Bruce Willis's final film on this list, especially in light of what we now know about his recent health struggles. Even yet, the gentlest of critics will struggle to deny that Assassin is an incredibly depressing footnote to the A-lister's storied career. At least this one is forgettable enough that it doesn't stick in the mind long, and Willis only shows up for just barely 5 minutes of screen time. It's truly terrible stuff. And while marking the end of Willis's career, his legacy will instead be defined by his many beloved hits which brought joy to millions, while Assassin is all but destined to be forgotten about in short order. Number 3. Ghosted. And the award for the most obviously AI-produced film of the year goes to Ghosted, an action comedy in which the producers clearly assumed that a genre romp starring Chris Evans and Ana de Armas would survive on their sheer sex appeal alone. Yet despite demonstrating great chemistry in Knives Out, there's something totally off about their interactions here, perhaps in part because it feels like their performances belong in entirely different movies. Even those game for some flirty fun and silly action will be short-served by the witless banter and anonymous mayhem. Hell, it's a desperate enough venture that Evans even ends up enlisting some of his MCU buddies to pop up for brief cameo appearances, without which Ghosted would have been completely unmemorable. If you can get through this film without checking your phone even once, then you deserve a damn medal. Number 2. The Expendables 4. Few were expecting much from the fourth Expendables movie, but oh boy did it underperform against even the lowest of expectations. Where to begin? First off, the cast is seriously thinned out this time around, with the likes of Arnold Schwarzenegger, Harrison Ford, Terry Crews, Jet Li, Antonio Banderas, and more conspicuously absent. Next, Stallone spends the vast majority of the movie benched, forcing Jason Statham to try and prop up the remaining action almost entirely single-handedly, while new cast members like Megan Fox and Andy Garcia barely make a dent. And then there's the VFX, which genuinely looks worse than many recent low-budget streaming action movies, despite this rocking an embarrassingly huge $100 million budget. To be clear, that's how much John Wick 4 cost. Given that The Expendables 4 flopped with critics and audiences alike, it's effectively killed the franchise dead. And number 1, Winnie the Pooh, Blood and Honey. But the very worst of 2023 is also the most head-smackingly cynical, because the rights to Winnie the Pooh entered the public domain in 2022, of course someone came up with the idea to reimagine the character as a backwoods serial killer. Winnie the Pooh, Blood and Honey is a horribly inept slasher flick that wouldn't have received any attention at all were it not for the branding sticker haphazardly slapped on it. From the written on a cocktail napkin script to the atrocious performances, garbage gore effects, and hilariously lazy costumes for Pooh and Piglet, this is bare minimum filmmaking at its most grossly calculated. And most insane of all, the gambit absolutely paid off, with the film grossing $5 million against a mere $100,000 budget. Enough the director Rhys Frake Waterfield already has a sequel and spin-off starring Bambi and Peter Pan in the works. So that's something to look forward to, right? Yep.